Sometimes the smallest gestures echo through time in ways we never expect. A shared meal, a moment of compassion, a choice to care when no one is watching. What began as simple sandwiches handed through a chain-link fence would grow into something that defied every rule about how the world is supposed to work. This is a story about quiet generosity, unexpected returns, and how 12 seemingly impossible moments can rewrite the ending to a life that seemed already written. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Nebraska plains stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the occasional farmhouse or grain elevator rising like a prayer against the horizon. It was October, and the cornfields had turned the color of old honey, rustling with that particular sound that meant winter was coming, whether anyone was ready or not. The sky hung low and gray, threatening rain that might or might not come. Joshua Martinez pulled his worn Ford F-150 into the gravel parking lot of Lincoln Elementary School, the truck's engine giving that familiar wheeze that meant another repair. Bill was somewhere in his near future. The dashboard clock read 3:47 p.m., which meant he was cutting it close again. Between his shift at the meatpacking plant and picking up his 8-year-old son Marcus from after-school care, every minute of Joshua's day was accounted for, planned. And usually running about 10 minutes behind schedule, he sat in the truck. For a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, allowing himself exactly 30 seconds to feel the weight of everything pressing down on his shoulders. The bill spread across his kitchen table at home, as the notice from the landlord about the rent increase. The way Marcus had been asking about his mother more frequently lately. Questions that Joshua didn't know how to answer without lying or breaking both their hearts a little more. 3 years. It had been 3 years since Maria had left, and Joshua still woke up some mornings, expecting to hear her voice in the kitchen. Still caught himself buying her favorite coffee at the grocery store before remembering. The divorce papers had cited irreconcilable differences, but Joshua knew the truth was simpler and more complicated than that. Maria had wanted a different life. One that didn't include the daily struggle of making ends meet in a town where opportunities were as scarce. As rain in a drought year, Joshua pulled the keys from the ignition and stepped out of the truck, his work boots crunching on the gravel. His hands still smelled like the industrial soap from the plant, despite scrubbing them raw in the employee washroom. The smell never really went away, just faded to something background and familiar. Like the sound of his own breathing, the after-school program was housed in a converted portable classroom behind the main building. One of those temporary structures that had become permanent through years of budget constraints and deferred maintenance. As Joshua approached, he could hear the controlled chaos inside, children's voices mixing with the patient instructions of Mrs. Chen, the program coordinator who somehow managed to keep 25 kids occupied and relatively safe until their parents could collect them. Through the window, Joshua spotted Marcus immediately. His son sat alone at a corner table, bent over a notebook with the intense concentration he brought to everything he cared about. Even at 8, Marcus had inherited his father's focus, the ability to disappear into a task completely. Today it looked like he was drawing, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration. Joshua knocked softly on the door, framed before entering. Mrs. Chen looked up from helping a girl with her math homework and smiled, the kind of smile that was warm, but also slightly concerned. Joshua had learned to read those smiles over the past 3 years. "Mr. Martinez," she said, approaching him with that careful way adults had when they needed to discuss something sensitive. Marcus had a good day, very focused on his artwork as usual. "It's good to hear," Joshua replied, though he could sense there was more coming. "I did want to mention," Mrs. Chen continued, lowering her voice, "that he asked for seconds at snack time today and yesterday. I gave them to him, of course, but I wondered if perhaps breakfast had been light, or—" She trailed off, leaving the question hanging in the air like smoke. Joshua felt heat creep up his neck. It wasn't judgment in her voice, just concern, but it still felt like a spotlight on his failures as a provider. "We're between grocery trips," Joshua said, which was technically true. They were always between grocery trips when money was tight, which was most of the time. "I'll make sure he has a bigger breakfast tomorrow." Mrs. Chen nodded, her expression understanding. "Of course. And please remember, if you ever need information about the free breakfast program or the weekend backpack program, I have all those forms. Joshua had heard about these programs, had seen other parents picking up the discreet bags of food on Friday afternoons. He'd told himself his pride was worth more than his son's hunger, but moments like this made him question that math.
Thank
You, he said simply. I'll keep that in mind. Marcus looked up as his father approached, his face lighting up with the uncomplicated joy that children still possessed before the world taught them to be cautious with their happiness. Dad, look what I drew. The notebook was filled with an elaborate drawing of a house, but not just any house. This house had multiple stories, wraparound porches, a tire swing hanging from an enormous oak tree, and what appeared to be a garden, bigger than their current apartment. Small figures stood in the yard, a man, a boy, and curiously, a woman with long dark hair who looked suspiciously like Marcus's mother. It's beautiful, buddy, Joshua said, meaning it. Tell me about it. Marcus launched into a detailed explanation of each room, each tree, each carefully drawn window. The enthusiasm in his voice was infectious, but it also made Joshua's chest tight with the weight of dreams he couldn't afford to fulfill. The house in the drawing probably cost more than Joshua made in 5 years. And see this part? Marcus pointed to a section of the drawing Joshua had initially mistaken for a fence. This is where we could have chickens. Fresh eggs every morning. Chickens. In town might be against the rules, Joshua said gently. Not if we lived outside town, Marcus replied with 8-year-old logic, like where the Hendersons live. They have chickens and horses and everything. The Hendersons were one of the families in Marcus's class, the kind of family that drove new SUVs and took vacations to places Marcus had only seen in picture books. Joshua had learned not to compare, but children hadn't developed that skill. Yet, they gathered Marcus's backpack and art supplies, a routine so familiar it required no thought. Outside, the threatened rain had started, just a light mist that made everything look softer around the edges. They drove home through streets Joshua had known his entire life, past the closed downtown storefronts and the new dollar store that had put 3 local businesses out of operation. Their apartment was on the 2nd floor of a converted house on Maple Street. It's a kind of place that had been someone's proud family home 50 years ago before being carved up into rental units. The stairs creaked in a specific pattern that Joshua had memorized, the key stuck in the door lock in a way that required exactly the right amount of pressure and patience. Inside, the apartment was small but clean. His mother that dignity wasn't about what you owned, but about how you cared for what you had. The furniture was second-hand but well-maintained, the floor swept, the dishes always done before bed. Marcus's artwork covered one wall of the living room, a gallery of his imagination that was the most colorful thing in their small world. Homework first, Joshua said, hanging his jacket on the hook by the door. Then we'll figure out dinner. The refrigerator was a constant source of anxiety for Joshua, a daily reminder of the math that never quite worked out right. Tonight it held eggs, a half-gallon of milk, some leftover rice, and vegetables that were approaching their expiration date. He could make fried rice, stretch it with extra rice, and hope Marcus didn't ask for seconds, while Marcus spread his homework across the kitchen table. Joshua started cooking, listening to his son work through math problems aloud. Marcus had a habit of talking through his thinking, a trait that reminded Joshua painfully of Maria. She had done the same thing, working through problems by speaking them into existence. Dad, Marcus looked up from his worksheet. Why don't we have a lot of food like Tommy's family? The question was asked with innocent curiosity, but it hit Joshua like a physical blow. He turned from the stove, spatula in hand, and looked at his son's earnest face. We have enough, Joshua said carefully. Some families have more, some have less. What matters is that we take care of each other. But Tommy's mom packs 2 sandwiches in his lunch every day, and sometimes he gives me half of the second one because he can't eat it all. Joshua felt something twist in his chest. His son was getting charity from classmates, and Joshua hadn't even known. The shame was immediate and overwhelming, followed quickly by a fierce gratitude toward Tommy and his family. It's very kind of Tommy, Joshua managed. His mom makes really good sandwiches, Marcus continued, returning to his math. Turkey and cheese and pickles and this sauce that tastes like Christmas. Joshua finished cooking in silence, his mind turning over his son's words. Christmas sauce? He wondered what that meant. What flavor could remind a child of Christmas? When he was Marcus's age, Christmas had meant his grandmother's tamales. The smell of cinnamon and masa, the sound of family filling every corner of their small house. He wanted to give Marcus those kinds of memories, but most days, he was just trying to make sure they had enough to eat. They ate dinner together at the small table, Marcus chattering about his day while Joshua tried to focus on his son's words. Instead of the worry that sat like a stone in his stomach, after dinner, they did the dishes together, another routine that had become sacred. Marcus washed, standing on a step stool to reach the sink, while Joshua dried and put everything away. Bath time, story time, tucking Marcus into bed with the threadbare quilt that had been Joshua's own childhood blanket. These rituals felt important, like they were building something together, even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dad? Marcus's voice was sleepy but thoughtful. Do you think we'll ever have a house like the one I drew? Joshua sat on the edge of the bed, looking down at his son's face in the dim light from the hallway. Marcus had Maria's eyes, darkened, expressive, always seeing more than most people gave him credit for. I don't know, buddy, Joshua said honestly. But I know we'll always have each other, and that's the most important part of any house. Marcus nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer. I love you, Dad. I love you too, son. Sleep tight. Joshua stood in the doorway for a moment after Marcus fell asleep, watching the rise and fall of his son's chest. 8 years old and already learning lessons about want and disappointment that Joshua wished he could delay. But Marcus was resilient. It's adaptable in the way children had to be when life didn't offer them choices. In the living room, Joshua spread the bills across the coffee table, a nightly ritual that never got easier. Electric bill, rent, car insurance, medical bills from Marcus's last checkup. The numbers were stark and unforgiving, telling a story Joshua already knew by heart. His paycheck from the plant covered the basics, barely, but there was no margin for error, no cushion for emergencies or unexpected expenses. He thought about Mrs. Chen's offer, the free breakfast program and the weekend food backpacks. Pride. It was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when it meant his son was hungry. Tomorrow, he decided, he would ask for those forms. Outside. The rain had picked up, drumming against the windows, with steady persistence. Joshua made himself a cup of coffee with the last of the grounds and sat in the dark living room. Planning the next day, the next week, the careful choreography of survival that had become his life's primary skill. He thought about Marcus's drawing. That elaborate house with its tire swing and garden and the family standing in the yard, the woman with long dark hair. Even at 8, Marcus was holding on to hope for something Joshua had learned not to dream about. Maybe that was enough. Maybe keeping that hope alive in his son was worth more than all the things they couldn't have. The coffee grew cold in his hands as Joshua sat in the darkness, listening to the rain and the soft sound of his son's breathing from the bedroom. Tomorrow would bring another day at the plant, another careful accounting of groceries, another evening of homework and dinner and the rituals that held their small world together. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was theirs, and he would protect it with everything he had. In a few hours, Joshua would discover that protection sometimes came from unexpected places, that kindness had a way of multiplying in ways that defied logic, and that the universe sometimes kept a more careful accounting of generosity than any ledger book could track. But tonight, he was just a father sitting in the dark, loving his son and trying to figure out how to make tomorrow a little easier than today. The morning fog clung to the Nebraska fields like cotton batting. It's thick enough that Joshua had to slow his truck to navigate the rural road that served as his shortcut to the plant. It was Thursday, October 18th, and he was running later than usual because Marcus had woken up with a stomach ache that turned out to be nerves about a spelling test. They'd spent an extra 20 minutes going through the word list one more time, Marcus's small voice carefully pronouncing each syllable while Joshua packed their lunches. The riverside meet. Processing plant sat on the outskirts of town like a sprawling concrete monument to efficiency, its smokestacks visible from miles away. Joshua had worked there for 4 years now, ever since the furniture factory closed and took half the decent jobs in the county with it. The work was hard, the hours long, and the smell followed you home no matter how much you scrubbed, but it paid better than anything else available to a man with a high school diploma and no connections. Joshua pulled into the employee parking lot, gravel crunching under his tires. The first shift was already an hour into their day, which meant the cafeteria would be relatively quiet during his lunch break. He preferred it that way. The noise and chaos of the main lunch rush made it harder to think, and Joshua did his best. Thinking during the 30 minutes, he allowed himself to sit still each day. The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of assembly line work. Joshua's station was near the end of the processing line, where his job was to inspect and package cuts of beef that would end up in grocery stores across 3 states. It was detail work that required focus but left his mind free to wander. To think about Marcus's spelling test, the grocery list that needed careful prioritization, the way his son had drawn that house with such precise hope. Around 10:30, during his first break, Joshua stepped outside for air. The employee break area was a concrete pad with a few picnic tables and an overflowing ashtray. Not much to look at, but better than the fluorescent lights and industrial fans inside. He was drinking coffee from his thermos when he first noticed them. 2 children stood at the chain-link fence that separated the plant property from the county road. They were small, probably no older than Marcus, with dirt-streaked faces and clothes that looked like they'd been slept in. Twins, from the look of them, with the same dark hair and sharp features. They stood perfectly still, watching the workers. Through the fence with the patient attention of children who had learned that good things sometimes came to those who waited quietly. Joshua finished his coffee and went back inside. But something about the children nagged at him. There was no school bus stop near the plant, no residential area within walking distance. What were 2 kids doing alone on a county road at 10:30 on a Thursday morning? During his lunch break, he grabbed his usual sandwich and headed outside. Again, the children were still there, now sitting in the grass beside the fence. They hadn't moved more than a few yards in 2 hours, which struck Joshua as odd. Kids that age couldn't usually sit still for 10 minutes, let alone 2 hours. He approached the fence slowly, not wanting to startle them. Close, he could see that their clothes weren't just dirty but worn thin, patched in places with fabric that didn't quite match. The girl's shoes had holes that had been covered with duct tape. The boy's shirt was too big for him, hanging off his thin frame like a hand meat down from someone much larger. "Hey there," Joshua said softly. "You kids okay?" The girl looked up at him with eyes that seemed too old for her face. "We're fine, mister," she said. But her voice had a careful quality that suggested she'd been coached on what to say to adults who ask questions. "You sure?" Joshua pressed gently. "It's a school day." "Shouldn't you be in class?" The boy spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. "We don't go to school right now. Are you waiting for someone?" The twins exchanged a look that was pure communication, the kind of silent conversation that only siblings could have. The girl seemed to come to some internal decision. "Sometimes the workers share their lunch," she said matter-of-factly. "Not all the time, but sometimes." "We're not begging," she added quickly. "We just wait, and if someone wants to share, that's nice." Joshua felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that was both immediate and painful. He looked at these children and saw Marcus, saw himself at their age, saw the careful dignity that poor people learned to wear when the world insisted on stripping them of everything else. "What are your names?" he asked. "I'm Emma," the girl said. "This is my brother Luke. I'm Joshua. I work inside." He gestured toward the plant. "How long have you been out here today?" "Since the sun came up," Luke said. "We walked here from town." Town was 5 miles away. These children had walked 5 miles to sit by a fence on the off chance that strangers might share their food. The mathematics of desperation were stark and undeniable. Joshua looked at his sandwich of peanut butter and jelly that would have to hold him until dinner. He'd packed it carefully that morning, using the last of the peanut butter and counting out exactly 2 slices of bread. But looking at Emma and Luke, he couldn't imagine eating it while they watched. "You hungry?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. Both children nodded, a careful composure cracking just enough to show the 8-year-olds underneath. Joshua unwrapped his sandwich and broke it into 3 pieces, passing 2 through the fence. "It's not much," he said. Emma took her piece with both hands, holding it like something precious. "Thank you," she said, and the gratitude in her voice was so complete, so genuine, that Joshua had to look away. They ate in silence, the 3 of them separated by chain link, but connected by something more fundamental. When they finished, Luke carefully folded the wax paper and handed it back through the fence. "We should go," Emma said, standing and brushing grass off her jeans. "Thank you for sharing." "Where are you headed?" Joshua asked. "Back to town," she said simply, as if a 5-mile walk was the most natural thing in the world. Joshua watched them start down the county road. 2 small figures walking hand in hand along the gravel shoulder. They moved with the steady determination of children who had walked long distances before. But something about the sight made his chest tight with worry. He went back inside but couldn't concentrate on his work. The image of Emma and Luke walking, that long road, stayed with him through the afternoon shift, through the drive home, through dinner with Marcus. That night, after Marcus was asleep, Joshua sat at his kitchen table and tried to make sense of what he'd seen. 2 children, alone and hungry, walking 10 miles round trip for the possibility of a shared meal. No adults in sight, no explanation. For why they weren't in school? In a town the size of Millbrook, it meant one of 2 things. Either their situation was so desperate that no one knew about it, or people knew and weren't doing anything about it. The next morning, Joshua packed 2 sandwiches. He told himself it was just in case, that the children probably wouldn't be there again. But at 10:30, when he stepped outside for his first break, Emma and Luke were sitting in exactly the same spot beside the fence. This time, he didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the fence and passed them each a sandwich, along with the apple he'd been planning to save for his afternoon break. "You came back," Emma said, accepting the food with that same careful gratitude. "You did too," Joshua replied. Over the following week, it became routine. Joshua would pack extra food, and Emma and Luke would be waiting by the fence during his breaks. They never asked for anything directly, never demanded or expected, but they were there with the consistency of sunrise, patient and hopeful and heartbreakingly polite. Joshua learned small details about them through careful questions. They were 9 years old, not 8, as he'd first guessed. They lived with their grandmother in a trailer on the outskirts of town. Their mother was away, a description Emma gave with the diplomatic vagueness of a child protecting family secrets. Their father wasn't in the picture, hadn't been for as long as they could remember. "Grandma's not feeling good lately," Luke explained one day while sharing a ham sandwich Joshua had splurged on. "She sleeps a lot. Does she know you come here?" Joshua asked. Emma and Luke exchanged another of their silent conversations. "She knows we go for walks," Emma said carefully. "We don't like to bother her when she's resting." The picture that emerged was troubling but not uncommon in rural Nebraska. An elderly woman struggling to care for 2 grandchildren, probably, dealing with health issues, possibly overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. The children were doing what children did in such situations, adapting, surviving, finding ways to meet their needs without adding to the burden of adults who were already carrying too much. Joshua started packing bigger lunches, bringing fruit and crackers in addition to sandwiches. He began timing his breaks to coincide with Emma and Luke's visits, and found himself looking forward to their quiet conversations. They were bright children, curious and thoughtful, with the kind of resilience that developed early in kids who had to grow up fast. One Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after their first meeting, Joshua noticed that Luke was favoring his left foot as they walked away. The next morning, he saw why. The boy's shoe had completely separated from its sole, held together by nothing but duct tape and determination. That weekend, Joshua took Marcus to the thrift store, ostensibly to look for winter clothes. While Marcus examined a rack of comic books, Joshua quietly purchased 2 pairs of children's shoes in sizes he hoped would fit. He spent money he couldn't afford on shoes for children who weren't his. And somehow it felt like the most important purchase he'd made in months. On Monday morning, he wrapped the shoes in a grocery bag and brought them to work. When Emma and Luke appeared at their usual time, he passed the bag through the fence, along with their sandwiches. "These were lost and found at my son's school," he lied easily. "They've been there for months, and the school was going to donate them anyway. I thought they might fit." It was a careful fiction, designed to preserve dignity while meeting need. Emma and Luke understood the game immediately, accepting the shoes with thanks. That was no less genuine for being built on a shared pretense. Luke's face when he tried on the shoes was something Joshua would remember for the rest of his life. Pure joy, uncomplicated and bright, the expression of a child who had received something wonderful and unexpected. The shoes fit perfectly. That afternoon, Joshua made a decision that would change everything, though he couldn't have known it at the time. As Emma and Luke prepared to make their long walk home, he called out to them. "Hey," he said, "would you like a ride?" The twins froze, identical expressions of surprise and uncertainty crossing their faces. They'd probably been taught about stranger danger, about not getting in cars with people they didn't know well, but they'd also been taught about kindness, about the difference between help and harm. And after 2 weeks of shared meals and quiet conversation, Joshua didn't feel like a stranger anymore. Emma looked at Luke, then back at Joshua. "Are you?" "Sure. It's on my way home," Joshua said, which was true if he took the long route through town, save you the walk. They climbed into his truck with the careful movements of children in an unfamiliar environment, Emma helping Luke with his seatbelt, while Joshua adjusted his rearview mirror. As they drove through the Nebraska countryside, past fields of harvested corn and scattered farmhouses, Joshua felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The particular satisfaction that came from being exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were supposed to do. He had no way of knowing that this simple act of kindness, a ride home for 2 hungry children, would set in motion. It's a series of events that would transform not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. All he knew was that Emma and Luke needed help, and he was in a position to provide it. In that moment, it was enough. The decision to help them wasn't dramatic or difficult. It was as natural as breathing, as automatic as the way he would reach out to steady Marcus if his son stumbled. Some choices revealed character, others created it. Joshua was about to discover that sometimes the smallest gestures cast the longest shadows, and that kindness, like light, had a way of traveling much farther than anyone expected. The trailer park where Emma and Luke lived was called Sunset Vista, though there was no vista to speak of, and the sunsets were largely blocked by the industrial grain elevator that loomed over the eastern edge of the property. It was a collection of aging mobile homes arranged in rough rows, connected by gravel roads that turned to mud whenever it rained. Joshua had driven past it countless times over the years, but had never really seen it, the way people learn not to see poverty when it becomes too familiar. Emma directed him through the maze of trailers with the confidence of someone who knew every pothole and loose gravel patch by heart. "Third row, blue one with the broken step," she said, pointing toward a single wide that had once been powder blue, but had faded to the color of old denim. A small wooden step leading to the front door hung at an angle, supported by a cinder block and what appeared to be determination. As Joshua pulled his truck to a stop, he noticed details that painted a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see clearly. Laundry hung on a line stretched between 2 fence posts, but it was the same few items he'd seen Emma and Luke wearing, washed and unwashed until the fabric had given up any pretense of color. A small vegetable garden struggled in a patch of dirt beside the trailer, yielding a few tomatoes and what looked like the remnants of a potato crop. "This is us," Luke said, unbuckling his seatbelt with the methodical care of a child who'd been taught to be respectful of other people's property. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Joshua," Emma added, already reaching for the door handle. Joshua said, though he wasn't sure why. Something about the whole scene felt unfinished, like he was dropping them off at the edge of a story he needed to understand better. The trailer's front door opened, and a woman emerged, who was clearly the grandmother the twins had mentioned. She was small and thin, wearing a housecoat that had seen better decades. and she moved with the careful slowness of someone managing pain. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face held the kind of weariness that came from carrying too much for too long. When she saw Joshua's truck, her expression shifted to something between curiosity and concern. She walked toward them with measured steps, her slippers scuffing against the gravel. "Emma, Luke," she called, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing children but lacking the energy to enforce rules strictly. "Who's this?" Emma climbed out of the truck and ran to her grandmother, Luke close behind. "This is Mr. Joshua, Grandma Betty. He works at the plant and he gave us a ride home." Betty's eyes met Joshua's through the windshield, and he saw in them the complex calculation that every grandparent in her situation had to make. Gratitude for kindness mixed with wariness of strangers, relief that her grandchildren were safe, tempered by embarrassment at the circumstances that made such kindness necessary. Joshua rolled down his window. "Ma'am," he said with the respectful tone his own grandmother had drilled into him, "I hope it's all right. I've been seeing Emma and Luke during my lunch breaks, and when I noticed they had a long walk home, I thought I'd offer a ride." Betty studied him for a long moment, taking in his work clothes, his tired eyes, the careful way he spoke that suggested he understood something about dignity and struggle. "That's very kind of you," she said finally. "I'm Betty Clearwater. These two are my world, though they're probably more adventures than you bargained for. They're good kids," Joshua said simply. Very polite. Something in Betty's expression softened. "They've had to learn to be. Come inside for a minute if you have time. I'd like to thank you properly." Joshua glanced at his dashboard clock. He needed to pick up Marcus soon, but something about Betty's invitation felt important. Like an opportunity to understand the full picture of what Emma and Luke were dealing with at home. The interior of the trailer was clean, but spare, furnished, with the kind of mismatched pieces that came from thrift stores and yard sales. The living room was barely large enough for a couch and a small television, but it was tidy, with Emma's and Luke's schoolwork spread neatly on a folding table that served as both desk and dining room. "Coffee?" Betty asked, already moving toward a small kitchenette. "That would be nice. Thank you." While Betty prepared coffee with the ritualistic care of someone for whom hospitality was important regardless of circumstances, Joshua looked around the small space. The walls held a few family photographs, including one of Emma and Luke as toddlers with a young woman who shared their features. Their mother, presumably, thought Betty didn't volunteer any information about her. "The kids tell me you've been sharing your lunch with them," Betty said, settling into a chair across from Joshua with two mismatched mugs. "I want you to know how grateful I am, and also how embarrassed." "You don't need to be embarrassed," Joshua said quickly. "Don't I?" Betty's smile was rueful. Two 9-year-olds walking 5 miles each way because their grandmother can't keep enough food in the house? I think embarrassment is the least of what I should be feeling. Joshua sipped his coffee, which was weak but hot, and chose his words carefully. "We all do what we can with what we have. From what I can see, you're raising 2 remarkable children." "They are that," Betty agreed, her voice warming with pride. "Too remarkable sometimes. They worry about me more than children their age should have to worry about anyone." As if summoned by the mention of their names, Emma and Luke appeared. In the living room, having changed out of their school clothes into even more worn play clothes, they moved around their grandmother with the practiced efficiency of children who'd learned to be helpful. Luke, bringing her a small pillow for her back, Emma quietly clearing away the schoolwork to make room. "How long have you been caring for them?" Joshua asked. 3 years now, Betty said. "Their mother, well, she's working through some problems. Problems that are easier to work through when you don't have 2 children depending on you every day." It was a diplomatic way of describing what Joshua suspected was a more complicated and painful situation. Addiction, most likely, or mental. Health issues, or simply the kind of overwhelm that made some people disappear from their own lives and their father. Never been in the picture. Rebecca was 17 when she had them. The boy who got her pregnant was 18 and not ready for the responsibility. Betty's tone was matter-of-fact, without judgment but also without illusion. Joshua did the math. Betty had been raising her grandchildren since she was probably in her mid-60s, dealing with the physical and financial challenges of caring for twins while managing what appeared to be her own health issues. I worked at the nursing home in town for 15 years, Betty continued, as if reading his thoughts. But my back gave out, and my disability doesn't stretch as far as it used to. We get by mostly, but some months are tighter than others. Climbed onto the couch beside her grandmother, curling against her side with the casual affection of a child who felt completely secure in her place in the world, despite everything else being uncertain. Mr. Joshua has a little boy, too, Emma announced. His name is Marcus, and he's 8, and he draws pictures just like Luke does. Is that so? Betty looked at Joshua with renewed interest. A single father?
Ow!
For about 3 years now, Joshua. Confirmed. Then you understand something about trying to be everything to a child while figuring out how to keep the lights on. The understanding that passed between them was immediate and complete. They were both guardians trying to stretch insufficient resources across the infinite needs of children they loved more than their own lives. The specifics were different, but the essential mathematics were the same. Luke, who had been drawing quietly at the folding table, brought his picture over to show Joshua. It was a detailed sketch of the meatpacking plant, complete with the fence where they met each day, and tiny figures representing the 3 of them sharing lunch. "This is really good," Joshua said, studying the careful proportions and surprising. "Attention to detail. You're quite an artist," Luke beamed. "Emma says I should draw things so we remember them." "Smart sister," Joshua said, ruffling the boy's hair. As the afternoon wore on, Joshua found himself reluctant to leave. There was something about the atmosphere in the small trailer that reminded him of his own childhood, why his grandmother had created a sense of abundance even when money was scarce. Betty had that same gift, the ability to make a small space feel full of love and possibility, but Marcus would be waiting. And Joshua had learned that children didn't adjust well to disruptions in routine, especially children who'd already experienced too much instability. "I should get going," he said, standing and carrying his mug to the kitchenette. "Thank you for the coffee and for letting me see where Emma and Luke call home." "Thank you for caring about them," Betty replied. "It means more than you know to. Have someone else looking out for them?" As Joshua drove toward town to collect Marcus, he found himself thinking about the contrasts he'd just witnessed. Betty's trailer was smaller and more worn than his apartment, but it felt more like a home. Despite having less money and more challenges, she'd created something for Emma and Luke that felt stable and secure. It made Joshua wonder what he might be missing in his own approach to single parenthood. Marcus was waiting on the school steps. When Joshua arrived, backpack slung over one shoulder and a drawing in his free hand, his face lit up when he saw his father's truck. The same uncomplicated joy that Joshua had seen in Luke's expression when he tried on the new shoes. "Dad, look what I made in art class today." The drawing was of their apartment building, rendered. With 8-year-old enthusiasm and a surprising attention to architectural detail, Marcus had included the crooked front steps, the mailboxes with their broken doors, even the neighbor's cat that liked to sun itself on the front porch. "It's our building," Marcus explained unnecessarily. "Mrs. Rodriguez said we should draw places that are important to us, so I drew home." Joshua felt something shift in his chest as he looked at his son's artwork. Marcus had drawn their building not as it was shabby and worn and temperate, but as it felt to him, important, secure, home. It was a reminder that children experienced the world differently than adults, that love could transform even the most humble spaces into something precious. "It's perfect," Joshua said, meaning it completely. On the drive home, Marcus chattered about his day. Joshua found his attention divided between his son's stories and his thoughts about Emma and Luke. 3 children, each dealing with circumstances beyond their control. It's finding ways to create meaning and connection despite limitations that would challenge most adults. That evening, while Marcus worked on homework at the kitchen table, Joshua called the school district's main office. After being transferred twice, he reached someone who could answer his questions about enrollment procedures for students whose living situations were complicated. Hypothetically, he said, if there were children who weren't currently enrolled but needed to be, what would that process look like? The conversation that followed was illuminating and troubling. All children were entitled to education regardless of their circumstances. But enrollment required documentation that many families in crisis didn't have readily available. There were programs to help, but they required knowing about them, navigating bureaucracy, having the time and energy to advocate effectively. After he hung up, Joshua sat at his kitchen table looking at the pamphlets he'd collected from Mrs. Chen about the free breakfast and weekend food programs. He'd been thinking about these resources in terms of his own pride and Marcus's needs. But now he was thinking about them differently. If he enrolled in these programs, he'd learn how they worked, who administered them, how families could access them. Information that might be useful for other people he knew who were struggling. The next morning, Joshua packed 3 lunches. His usual sandwich, one for Emma, one for Luke, and an extra apple that he told himself was just in case Marcus wanted a snack later. But as he drove to work, he was already planning the conversation he wanted to have with the twins about school, about the programs that might be available to help their grandmother, about the possibilities that existed if someone knew where to look for them. It was the beginning of something larger than shared meals, though Joshua didn't recognize it yet. He was starting to see himself not just as someone who could offer individual kindness, but as someone who might be able to help navigate systems, connect resources, bridge the gap between need and assistance. It was a subtle shift from charity to advocacy, from helping to empowering, and it would prove to be the foundation for everything that followed. When Emma and Luke appeared at the fence that morning, they brought something new with them, a hand-drawn thank you card that Luke had made, featuring all 4 members of their small community: Joshua, Marcus, Emma, and Luke standing together under a carefully crayoned sun. At the bottom, in Emma's neat printing, were the words "Friends help friends." Joshua taped the card to his workstation, where it would remind him every day that kindness wasn't just about what you gave, but about what you built together, one small gesture at a time. November arrived in Nebraska with a kind of bitter cold that made people walk faster and speak in shorter sentences. The fields around Millbrook had turned brown and brittle, and the morning frost stayed on the ground well into the afternoon. It was the kind of weather that made every small hardship feel larger, every worn coat and broken heater a matter of survival rather than mere discomfort. Joshua had fallen into a routine that felt as natural as breathing. Each morning he packed lunch for Emma and Luke, along with his own, timing his breaks to coincide with their visits to the fence. Over the past month, their conversations had grown longer and more substantial. The twins had started bringing their homework sometimes, spreading it on the ground while they ate, and Joshua found himself helping with math problems and reading assignments. More importantly, he'd managed to convince Betty to let him help with some of the bureaucratic obstacles that were keeping Emma and Luke out of school. It had taken 3 visits to the district office, 2 trips to the county health department for immunization records, and countless phone calls, but they were finally enrolled and scheduled to start classes after Thanksgiving break. The arrangement had become precious to all of them. Emma and Luke had someone who listened to their ideas and treated their thoughts as important. Joshua had discovered that helping them gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Maria left. Even Marcus had become invested in their welfare, often sending drawings or small toys through Joshua to share with his fence friends. He'd started calling them. But on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, everything changed. Joshua was running later than usual because of an equipment breakdown on the processing line that had backed up production for 2 hours. When he finally made it outside for his lunch break, Emma and Luke weren't at their usual spot by the fence. He waited 15 minutes, then 20, telling himself they'd probably just been delayed by something at home. But they didn't come. Wednesday was the same. Joshua stood by the fence with 2 wrapped sandwiches growing cold in his hands, scanning the county road for 2 small figures that never appeared. The silence felt wrong, ominous in a way that made his chest tight with worry. Thursday was Thanksgiving. The plant was closed. Joshua spent the day with Marcus, going through the motions of their modest holiday tradition, watching the parade on their small television, sharing a grocery store turkey that was too big for 2 people, calling his mother in Texas. But his mind kept drifting to the empty space by the fence, to Emma and Luke's absence that felt like a missing piece in a puzzle he couldn't solve. Friday morning, Joshua was at the fence before his shift even started, but there was still no sign of the twins. During his lunch break, he made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. He was going to drive to Sunset Vista and check on them, the trailer. Park looked different in daylight without Emma and Luke as guides. More run down, more desperate, like a place where hope came to die slowly. Joshua navigated the gravel roads carefully, looking for the blue trailer with the broken step. Trying to remember the landmarks Emma had pointed out during their previous visits, when he found it, his heart sank. The windows were dark, and there were no signs of life, no laundry on the line, no toys in the small yard, no movement behind the curtains. Joshua sat in his truck for several minutes, debating whether to approach the door. Something about the stillness of the place felt final, like walking into a house where someone had died. He knocked anyway. The door opened to reveal a stranger, middle-aged man in work clothes, with paint stains on his hands and the harried look of someone dealing with an unpleasant job. "Yeah," the man said. Not unfriendly, but clearly busy. "I'm looking for Betty Clearwater and her grandchildren," Joshua said. "They live here, or used to, do." The man's expression shifted to something more. "Sympathetic? You a friend of theirs?" Joshua realized he didn't know how to explain his relationship to Emma and Luke in a way that wouldn't sound strange. "I work at the plant. I've been helping with the kids." "Ah," the man nodded like this. "Explain something. Oh, they're gone. Betty had some kind of medical emergency Sunday night. Ambulance came. Took her to the hospital. Social services came for the kids Monday morning." The words hit Joshua like a physical blow. Social services. Foster care, I guess. Happens a lot around here. Old folks trying to raise grandkids when they can barely take care of themselves. The man shrugged, not cruel but matter-of-fact about a situation he'd probably seen play out many times before. "I'm just here to clean the place out for the landlord." Joshua felt the ground shift beneath him. "Do you know which hospital? Or which social services office? Is County General for the hospital? Don't know about the kids, though? That's all handled through the state office in Lincoln?" Lincoln was 2 hours away? 2 hours that might as well have been 2,000 miles for two children who'd just lost the only stable home they'd known. Joshua thanked the man and walked back to his truck on unsteady legs. He sat in the driver's seat, staring at the empty trailer, trying to process what he'd just learned. Betty was in the hospital, possibly seriously ill. Emma and Luke were somewhere in the foster care system, probably scared and confused, definitely. Separated from everything familiar, and he was completely powerless to help them. The drive back to town passed in a blur of anger and helplessness. Joshua's mind raced through possibilities, each one more impossible than the last. He had no legal standing with Emma and Luke, no relationship that the state would recognize. He was just a man who'd shared sandwiches with them, a strangerhood, inserted himself into their lives without any official permission or authority. That afternoon, he called the county hospital. After being transferred 3 times, reached someone who could confirm that Betty Clearwater was a patient, but couldn't provide any details about her condition due to privacy laws. When he mentioned that he was concerned about her grandchildren, the voice on the phone grew colder, more suspicious. "Are you a family member?" "No, but then I can't discuss any patient information with you." The line went dead. Joshua tried calling the state social services office, but the result was the same. No information available to non-family members. The children were in care, which was supposed to be reassuring, but sounded more like a euphemism for lost. That evening, Marcus sensed his father's distress immediately. Joshua had never been good at hiding his emotions from his son, and tonight he felt too raw to even try. "What's wrong, Dad?" Marcus asked over dinner, setting down his fork and giving Joshua the kind of serious attention that 8-year-olds reserved for truly important moments. Joshua considered lying, crafting some story that would protect Marcus from the harsh realities of what happened to children when the adults in their lives failed or fell down. But looking at his son's earnest face, he decided that honesty, carefully delivered, was better than deception. "Remember Emma and Luke, the kids I've been helping? At work?" Marcus nodded eagerly. "The ones who like my drawing of the robot?" Something happened to their grandmother. She got sick and had to go to the hospital. And now Emma and Luke are staying with different families until she gets better. Foster families? Marcus asked, and Joshua was surprised by how much his 8-year-old understood about the world's various arrangements for displaced children. Yes. Marcus considered this for a moment, his young face serious. Are they scared? Probably, Joshua admitted. Can we visit them? I don't know where they are, buddy. People who decide these things don't tell strangers like me. Marcus was quiet for a long time, pushing food around his plate without eating. Finally, he looked up at his father with the kind of determination that reminded Joshua painfully of Emma's fierce protectiveness of her brother. Said carefully, I was scared because I didn't know if you would leave too. But you didn't. No, Joshua said softly. I didn't. Maybe Emma and Luke are scared because they think everyone is going to leave them. Maybe someone should tell them that some people stay. Out of the mouths of babes. Joshua reached across the table and squeezed his son's hand, overwhelmed by the wisdom that children sometimes possessed when adults had lost their way. That weekend, Joshua drove to Lincoln. He didn't have an appointment, didn't have a plan beyond showing up and demanding information. He had no right to request. The state's social services building was a concrete monument to bureaucracy, all sharp angles and narrow windows that let in as little light as possible. The waiting room was filled with people who looked like they'd been waiting for hours or days or years. Joshua took a number and sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, rehearsing what he would say when his turn finally came. When his number was called 3 hours later, he found himself sitting across from a tired-looking woman named Sandra Phillips, who listened to his story with the polite attention of someone who'd heard thousands of similar stories. So you're not a relative, she said when he finished. No, not a legal guardian or foster parent. Oh, just someone who gave them food. The way she said it made his efforts sound trivial, inadequate. I helped them, Joshua said, hearing the defensiveness in his own voice. I'm sure you did, Sandra replied, not unkindly. But I can't give you information about minor children. In state care, even if I wanted to, which I'm not saying I do, it would be illegal. They don't know anyone in the system, Joshua pressed. They've never been away from their grandmother. They must be terrified. The children are safe, Sandra said firmly. They're in appropriate placements with trained foster families. That's all I can tell you. Can I at least know if they're together? Sandra's hesitation was answer enough. Joshua felt something break inside his chest. They're twins, he said urgently. They've never been separated. Emma takes care of Luke, and he needs her. You can't just, Mr. Martinez, Sandra interrupted. I understand your concern, but placement decisions are based on availability. Safety and the best interests of the children as determined by trained professionals. Sometimes, siblings have to be placed separately on a temporary basis. The word was supposed to be comforting, but Joshua had learned enough about the system to know that temporary could stretch into months or years. That children could age out of care without ever being reunited with their families. He left the building feeling defeated and angry, but also strangely determined. Sandra Phillips had made it clear that he had no official standing in Emma and Luke's lives, no legal right to information or influence over their placement. But she'd also inadvertently confirmed something important. The twins had been separated, and they needed someone to advocate for them. Joshua wasn't a social worker or a lawyer or a foster parent. He was just a man who worked at a meat processing plant and drove a truck with a failing transmission. But he was also someone who'd learned that Emma liked to draw maps of imaginary places, that Luke was afraid of dogs but loved cats, that both children said please and thank you with the automatic politeness of kids who'd been taught that manners mattered even when nothing else did. Sometimes, Joshua thought, as he drove home through the Nebraska darkness, being someone who remembered was more important than being someone with authority. And if the system wouldn't give him information about Emma and Luke, he'd find another way to help them. He just had to figure out what that way might be. December came to Nebraska with a vengeance, bringing the kind of cold that made car engines reluctant to start and turned every breath into visible proof of life. Joshua had spent 3 weeks trying every official channel he could think of to get information about Emma and Luke. and it hit a wall every time. The system designed to protect children had become an impenetrable fortress that kept out anyone who might actually care about their well-being. But on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, everything changed with a phone call. Joshua was pouring coffee into his thermos, preparing for another day at the plant when his cell phone rang. The number was local, but unfamiliar, and he almost didn't answer. Telemarketers had become aggressive lately, and Joshua had learned to be suspicious of unknown calls. "Hello? Is this Joshua Martinez?" The voice was elderly, female, with the careful diction of someone who'd spent years working with the public. Double quotes. "Yes. Who's this?" "My name is Dorothy Fitzgerald. Calling about Emma and Luke Clearwater." Joshua nearly dropped his coffee. "You? Know where they are?" "I should hope so," Dorothy said with a hint of dry humor. "Luke has been staying with me for the past 3 weeks. Joshua sank into his kitchen chair, his mind racing. "Is he okay? Are you his foster parent?" "I'm one of them, yes. And Luke is. Well, he's as okay as a 9-year-old can be when he's been separated from his sister and doesn't understand why he can't go home." The pain in Dorothy's voice was immediate and genuine. Joshua could hear something else in the background. The sound of cartoons playing on a television and a child's voice singing along to a commercial jingle. "How did you get my number?" Joshua asked. "Luke talks about you constantly. Mr. Joshua this, Mr. Joshua that. He's been asking if he could call you since the day he arrived, but I wasn't sure if that was appropriate. Foster care has a lot of rules about outside contact, but you're calling now." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "Luke drew a picture yesterday. It was you and him and Emma sharing lunch by a fence. When I asked him about it, he told me the whole story about how you fed them for months. How you helped his grandmother with school enrollment. How you drove them home." She paused. "This morning, I decided that some rules are less important than a child's need to feel connected to people who care about him." Joshua felt his throat tighten. "Can I talk to him? That's why I'm calling. But first, I need to know something. Luke seems to believe that you're going to come get him and Emma and take them home. I need to know if that's something you promised him, because if it is, I need to help him understand that the world doesn't work that way." "I never promised him anything like that," Joshua said quickly. "I don't have any legal standing. I've been trying to find them through social services, but no one will tell me anything." "Good," Dorothy said, and Joshua could hear relief in her voice. "I mean, it's good that you didn't make promises you can't keep. Children in care have usually heard enough of those to last several lifetimes." There was a pause, and then Dorothy's voice became more formal, more careful. "Mr. Martinez, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I'm breaking several rules by sharing this information with you. I understand. Emma is staying with a family in Omaha. Different county, different caseworker, different everything. The siblings were separated because there wasn't a single home available that could take both children on short notice. The plan is to reunite them when a suitable placement becomes available, but that could take months or longer. The system is overwhelmed, and twin placements are particularly challenging. Most foster families aren't equipped to take 2 children at once, especially children who've experienced trauma." Joshua closed his eyes, imagining Emma alone in a strange house in Omaha, probably trying to be brave while worrying about her brother. How was Luke handling the separation? "Not well," Dorothy admitted. "He's polite, he follows rules, he eats what I put in front of him, but he doesn't sleep through the night, and he won't talk about his feelings. He just draws pictures of you and Emma and asks when he can go home." The sound of cartoons in the background suddenly stopped, and Joshua heard footsteps. "Mrs. Dorothy?" Luke's voice was small, but clear. "Is that Mr. Joshua?" Dorothy must have covered the phone because her voice became muffled. Joshua could hear a brief conversation, and then Dorothy came back on the line. "He heard me say your name. Would you like to talk to him?" "Yes, please." There was rustling as the phone changed hands, and then Luke's voice, stronger now, filled with hope and excitement. "Mr. Joshua, I knew you'd find us. Told Mrs. Dorothy you would." Joshua's chest felt tight. "Hey, buddy, I've been looking for you and Emma. Are you okay?" "I'm okay, but I miss Emma, and I miss Grandma Betty." Mrs. Dorothy, says Grandma Betty, is getting better in the hospital, but she can't take care of us right now. Is that true? That's what I heard too, Joshua said carefully. Mrs. Dorothy's taking good care of you. She makes pancakes on Saturday mornings, and she has a cat named Oliver who sleeps on my bed. But I still want to come home. I know you do, Luke. I'm working on figuring out how to help, okay? Can you find Emma? I made her a Christmas present, but I can't give it to her if I don't know where she is. Joshua looked out his kitchen window at the gray December morning and made a decision that would change everything. Luke, can you put Mrs. Dorothy back on the phone? I want to ask her something. The phone changed hands again, and Dorothy's voice returned. He's a good boy, she said quietly. They both are, from what I understand. Mrs. Dorothy, Joshua said, what would it take for me to become a foster parent? The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Joshua wondered if the call had been dropped. Mr. Martinez? Dorothy said finally, that's not a decision you make lightly. Foster care is complicated, demanding work. These children have been through trauma, and they need specialized care. I understand that. But I also know them. I know that Emma worries about everyone except herself, and that Luke is braver than he thinks he is, and that they need each other more than they need anything else in the world. Dorothy was quiet again, and Joshua could hear her thinking, weighing possibilities. Even if you started the process today, she said, it would take months to complete. Home studies, background checks, training classes, interviews, and there's no guarantee that Luke and Emma would be placed with you even if you were approved. But it's possible. Theoretically, yes, if you were approved as a foster parent, and if their current placements weren't working out, and if you specifically requested them, and if their caseworkers agreed that it was in their best interest. She trailed off. That's a lot of ifs, Mr. Martinez. What's the first step? Dorothy gave him the phone number for the foster care training program and the name of a caseworker who handled initial inquiries. She also gave him something more valuable, hope. Mr. Martinez, she said before they hung up, I've been doing foster care for 15 years. I've seen a lot of people come and go, people who thought they wanted to help but weren't prepared for the reality. But I've also seen families, formed in unexpected ways, love growing in places where it wasn't supposed to exist. If you're serious about this, if you're really willing to commit to these children regardless of how difficult it gets, then maybe those ifs aren't as impossible as they sound. After the call ended, Joshua sat in his kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone number Dorothy had given him. Becoming a foster parent would mean opening his life to scrutiny, jumping through bureaucratic hoops, attending training sessions, and fundamentally changing the way he and Marcus lived. It would mean accepting to children who came with trauma and needs he didn't fully understand. It would also mean giving Emma and Luke a chance to be together again, to heal in a place where they were known and valued, to grow up with someone who understood that their worth wasn't measured by their circumstances. Joshua called in sick to work and spent the day on the phone. By evening, he had an appointment with a caseworker for the following week, enrollment in a foster parent training class that started in January, a list of requirements that seemed impossibly long and detailed. When Marcus came home from school, Joshua was surrounded by paperwork and pamphlets, his laptop open to a website about trauma-informed care for children in foster placement. Dad Marcus stood in the doorway, backpack still on his shoulders. Are you okay? Joshua looked at his son, this resilient, compassionate 8-year-old who'd already proven he could adapt to change and welcome new people into their small family. Marcus, Joshua said, how would you feel about Emma and Luke coming to live with us? Marcus dropped his backpack and climbed onto Joshua's lap, studying the papers spread across the table forever. He asked. Maybe it would mean we'd be a different kind of family, and there would be new rules and challenges. It would mean sharing our space and probably having less money for extras. Marcus considered this seriously, his young face thoughtful. Would they be safe? Yes. Would they be together? If everything works out, yes. Marcus nodded decisively. Then I want them to come home. Home. Marcus had called it home before Joshua had even figured out what he was offering. Children, Joshua reflected, sometimes understood love better than adults did. That night after Marcus was asleep, Joshua called Dorothy back. "I wanted to let you know," he said. "I'm starting the process. I've got my first meeting next week." "I'm glad," Dorothy said simply. "Luke will be glad too. He's been drawing pictures of a house with 4 bedrooms. 4 bedrooms? One for you, one for Marcus, one for him, and one for Emma. He's very specific about the details." Joshua smiled, thinking about Luke's artistic precision, his ability to imagine solutions to problems that adults found impossible. "Mrs. Dorothy," Joshua said, "if I do this, if I somehow manage to get approved and Emma and Luke come to live with us, will you help me? I don't know anything about being a foster parent, about dealing with trauma or working with caseworkers or any of it." "Mr. Martinez," Dorothy said warmly, "one of the best things about the foster care community is that we take care of each other. You won't be doing this alone." After they hung up, Joshua stood on his small apartment balcony, looking out at the lights of Millbrook scattered across the dark Nebraska landscape. Somewhere out there, Emma was probably lying awake in a strange bed, worrying about her brother and grandmother and wondering if anyone remembered that she existed. Luke was drawing pictures of imaginary houses and hoping for miracles he was too young to understand were unlikely. And Joshua was about to embark on a journey that would either bring his small family together in ways he'd never imagined, or teach him that some kinds of love weren't enough to overcome the barriers that systems and circumstances put in their way. But for the first time in weeks, he felt something that had been missing since that empty trailer and the closed bureaucratic doors possibility. The road ahead was uncertain and probably difficult, but it was a road that led somewhere specific, somewhere that mattered. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of becoming someone official enough to fight for Emma and Luke. Tonight, he would go to sleep, knowing that love, even the kind that appeared in unexpected places, sometimes found ways to build bridges over impossible distances. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When he opened it, he found a photo of a drawing, 4 stick figures, standing in front of a house with carefully drawn windows and a door painted bright red. At the bottom, in Luke's distinctive handwriting, were the words, "Our family soon." Dorothy must have helped him send it, but the hope in those 3 words was pure Luke, optimistic, determined, and absolutely certain that good things were not only possible, but inevitable. Looking at that drawing, Joshua began to believe that maybe Luke was right. March arrived in Nebraska with tentative warmth and the first green shoots pushing through the frost-hardened ground. Joshua had spent the past 4 months navigating a maze of paperwork, training sessions, home inspections, and interviews that had transformed both his apartment and his understanding of what it meant to be a family. The foster parent training classes had been held every Saturday morning in a sterile conference room at the county building, where Joshua sat with 12 other adults who decided to open their homes to children in need. Some were couples looking to adopt, others were experienced foster parents adding certifications, and a few, like Joshua, were single parents driven by specific circumstances they couldn't quite explain to the social workers conducting the sessions. The training had been simultaneously enlightening and overwhelming. Joshua learned about attachment disorders, trauma responses, the importance of maintaining connections to birth families, and the complex legal framework that governed every aspect of foster care. He learned that children in care often tested boundaries not out of defiance, but out of a desperate need to know if this placement, too, would eventually give up on them. Most importantly, he learned that love, while necessary, wasn't sufficient. Foster children needed structure, patience, advocacy, and adults who understood that healing happened slowly, with setbacks and breakthroughs that didn't follow any predictable timeline. During those months, Dorothy had become more than just Luke's foster parent. She'd become Joshua's mentor and friend. She called every few weeks with updates on Luke's progress and practical advice about dealing with caseworkers, court dates, and the dozens of small decisions that could make or break a placement. "He's doing better," Dorothy reported during one of their February calls. "Still draws pictures of you and Emma every day, but he's starting to make friends at school. And he's been helping me in the garden, planning what we'll plant this spring." "That's good," Joshua said, though something in Dorothy's tone suggested there was more to the story. "He asked me something yesterday that I think you should know about," Dorothy continued. He wanted to know if foster families ever kept children forever, even if their first families got better. Joshua felt his chest tighten. What did you tell him? The truth. That sometimes children stay with foster families permanently, and sometimes they go back to their birth families. And that both of those things can be good outcomes depending on the situation. How did he react? He thought about it for a long time, and then he said, I want Grandma Betty to get better, but I also want to live with Mr. Joshua and Marcus and Emma all together. I told him that sometimes we don't get to choose how our families work out, but that doesn't make the love any less real. 3 days later, Dorothy called with news that changed everything. Betty Clearwater has been discharged from the hospital, she said without preamble. She's been placed in an assisted living facility, and the doctors say she won't be able to care for children again. The state is terminating her guardianship and moving toward permanent placement for Emma and Luke. Joshua gripped the phone tighter. What does that mean? It means they'll be available for adoption, not just foster care. And it means that if your home study comes back approved, you could be considered for permanent placement. The home study had been conducted the previous week by a stern woman named Patricia Wells, who'd spent 3 hours examining every corner of Joshua's apartment, interviewing Marcus, and asking questions that seemed designed to uncover hidden instabilities or character flaws. She'd been particularly interested in Joshua's financial situation, his support network, and his plans for dealing with 2 children who'd experienced significant trauma. Mr. Martinez, Patricia had said as she finished her final notes, you seem like a caring person with good intentions. But raising 4 children, including twins who've been in the system, is exponentially more challenging than raising one. Are you certain you're prepared for that reality? Joshua had looked at Marcus, who was quietly reading in the corner, but obviously listening to every word. No, Joshua had said honestly. I'm not certain about anything except that Emma and Luke deserve to be together. They deserve adults who won't give up on them when things get difficult. Patricia had written something in her notebook that Joshua couldn't see and left without giving any indication of her recommendations. Now, 3 weeks later, Dorothy was calling with the news that everything hung on that home study. When will we know? Soon, Patricia's report should be submitted by the end of the week. And then, there'll be a placement meeting to discuss options. Joshua, Dorothy paused. I need to tell you something else. There's another family being considered for Emma and Luke, a couple in their 30s with no other children and a larger house. Joshua felt his stomach drop. Are they good people? They seem to be. Stable, financially secure, experienced with foster care. On paper, they probably look like the ideal placement. But they've never met Emma and Luke. They don't know that Emma has nightmares about being alone, or that Luke draws when he's worried, or that they both need to eat breakfast together every morning, or their whole day feels wrong. Dorothy's. The voice was warm with affection. They don't know that Luke saves the crusts from his sandwiches because that's what you taught him to do, or that Emma still carries the drawing Marcus made for her in her backpack. That weekend, Joshua received a call from Sandra Phillips, the social worker he'd met months earlier during his fruitless trip to Lincoln. Her tone was entirely different now, professional but respectful, recognizing him as a legitimate participant in the process rather than an interested stranger. Mr. Martinez, I have some good news. Your home study has been approved, and you've been certified as a foster parent. You're being considered for the placement of Emma and Luke Clearwater. Joshua sank into his kitchen chair, overwhelmed by relief and terror in equal measure. What happens next? There'll be a placement meeting next Friday. You'll have the opportunity to present your case for why you should be selected as their permanent guardian. The other prospective family will do the same, and then the placement committee will make their decision. After Sandra hung up, Joshua sat in his kitchen surrounded by the evidence of his 4-month journey toward this moment. Foster care training certificates, financial documents, character references from coworkers and neighbors he'd barely known before this process began. His apartment had been reorganized to accommodate 2 additional children. Marcus had moved into a smaller room so that Emma and Luke could each have their own space, a sacrifice he'd made without complaint. Most significantly, there was a letter on his kitchen table that had arrived the day before, addressed to him in Dorothy's careful handwriting. but containing something precious beyond measure. Inside the envelope were two drawings, one from Emma and one from Luke, along with a note explaining that Dorothy had arranged for the twins to speak to each other by phone the previous weekend, their first conversation in 4 months. Emma's drawing showed 4 people sitting around a kitchen table, with plates of food and glasses of milk carefully rendered in colored pencil. At the bottom, she'd written, "Mr. Joshua taught us that families eat together." Luke's drawing was more elaborate, a house with multiple rooms, each one labeled with a name. Dad's room, Marcus's room, my room, Emma's room, and in the center, kitchen, where we eat together every day. Dad's room. Luke had called it Dad's room. The note from Dorothy was brief but illuminating. "Emma asked me to tell you that she remembers everything you taught them about being patient and taking care of each other. Luke wanted me to tell you that he's been practicing tying his shoes so he can teach Marcus when they live together. They both wanted you to know that they understand this might not work out, but they're hoping anyway, because hope is what you gave them." Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that made important meetings feel more ominous than they probably were. Joshua had taken the day off work and driven the 2 hours to Lincoln with a folder of documents and a speech. He'd practiced dozens of times but couldn't seem to remember now that he actually needed it. The placement meeting was held in a conference room that smelled like coffee and industrial carpet, with Sandra Phillips presiding over a table full of social workers, supervisors, and advocates. The other perspective. Family was already there when Joshua arrived. David and Michelle Hartwell, exactly as Dorothy had described them. Well-dressed, confident, clearly successful in whatever they did for a living. Joshua took his seat across from them, acutely aware of his work clothes and calloused hands, the way his voice sounded when he was nervous. This wasn't a fair fight, and everyone in the room knew it. "Mr. Martinez," Sandra began, "would you like to tell us why you believe you'd be the best placement for Emma and Luke?" Joshua looked around the table at the faces watching him, all professional and evaluative, and realized that his prepared speech about stability and commitment wasn't what these children needed him to say. "I don't know if I'd be the best placement," he said slowly. "I don't have the biggest house, or the most money, or the most experience with foster care. But I know Emma and Luke. I know that Emma worries about everyone except herself, and that she needs to feel useful to feel secure. I know that Luke is braver than he thinks he is, but he processes the world through art, and he needs time to trust new people." He pulled out Luke's most recent drawing, the one with the labeled rooms, and placed it on the table. "I know that they've been separated for 4 months, and that every day apart has been hard for them, because they're not just siblings, they're best friends in each other's security system. I know that Luke saves food when he's worried about where his next meal is coming from, and that Emma will give up her own needs to take care of other people." Joshua looked directly at the Hartwells, who were listening with the polite attention of people hearing about children they'd never met. "I also know that they've been through more trauma than most adults experience in a lifetime, and that they're going to need patience and understanding, and probably therapy, and definitely adults who won't give up on them when things get difficult, because things will get difficult." He paused, thinking about Marcus at home, probably doing homework at the kitchen table they'd all eat dinner around that evening. "But most importantly, I know that they're not broken children who need fixing. They're resilient, loving, intelligent, kids who deserve a family that sees their strengths instead of just their needs. My son Marcus knows this too, and he's been preparing for months to be their brother." The room was quiet when Joshua finished. Sandra made notes on her legal pad, and the other committee members exchanged glances that Joshua couldn't interpret. The Hartwells gave their presentation next, and it was polished and thorough. They talked about their financial stability, a large house with separate bedrooms and a backyard, their flexible work schedules that would allow them to be present for therapy, appointments, and school meetings. They spoke about their experience with their nephew who'd had behavioral problems, and their commitment to providing structure and consistency. Everything they said was reasonable and appropriate, and Joshua knew that on paper, they probably looked like the obvious choice. But when they finished, Sandra asked a question that seemed to shift the energy in the room. "Have either of you met Emma and Luke?" David Hartwell shook his head. "We've read their files and seen photographs, but we haven't met them in person. Yet, we were told that wouldn't happen until after placement decisions were made. Sandra nodded and made another note. Then she looked at Joshua. Mr. Martinez, in your opinion, what would Emma and Luke say if we asked them where they wanted to live? Joshua thought about Luke's drawings, about Emma's careful letter asking if he was still trying to find them, about Dorothy's reports of children who still talked about him every day. I think, Joshua said carefully, they would say they want to be together, wherever that is. I think they would say they want to live somewhere they're known and valued, not just cared for. The meeting concluded with Sandra explaining that. The committee would deliberate and announce their decision within a week. As Joshua gathered his papers and prepared to drive home, David Hartwell approached him. Mr. Martinez, David said, extending his hand. I just wanted to say that those children are lucky to have someone who knows them so well, advocating for them.
Good kids,
Joshua replied, shaking the man's hand. Whoever gets them is going to be the lucky one. The drive home felt longer than usual, and Joshua spent it replaying every word of the meeting, trying to read meaning into expressions and tones that were probably trained to reveal nothing. But underneath his anxiety was something else, the quiet certainty that he'd said what needed to be said, that he'd represented Emma and Luke as honestly as he could. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. That evening, as he and Marcus ate dinner at their small kitchen table, Joshua told his son about the meeting. Do you think we'll get to be their family? Marcus asked, his 8-year-old heart already fully invested in siblings he'd been preparing to welcome for months. Don't know, buddy, Joshua said honestly, but I know we did everything we could. Marcus considered this, twirling spaghetti around his fork with the concentration of a child working through complex thoughts. Dad, he said finally, even if they can't come live with us, they'll still be our friends, right? Like, forever friends? Joshua felt his chest tighten with love for this boy who understood that some connections transcended legal arrangements and physical proximity. Yes, Joshua said, forever friends. 3 days later, Sandra Phillips called with news that would change all of their lives. Sandra Phillips's voice was steady and professional when she called Wednesday afternoon. But Joshua could hear something underneath the formality that made his heart race with possibility. Mr. Martinez, the placement committee, has reached a decision regarding Emma and Luke Clearwater. The committee voted unanimously to place both children with you, effective immediately, with the goal of moving toward adoption within 6 months. Joshua set down the wrench he'd been holding and sank onto his couch, the magnitude of Sandra's words hitting him like a physical force. They're coming home? They're coming home, Sandra confirmed, and now her professional mask slipped just enough to reveal genuine warmth. The committee was particularly impressed by your knowledge of the children's individual needs and your commitment to maintaining their sibling bond. Your son Marcus's maturity and enthusiasm for gaining siblings also factored significantly into the decision. When Joshua managed to ask, "This weekend, Dorothy will drive Luke down on Saturday morning, and I'll be bringing Emma from Omaha. We thought it would be meaningful for them to arrive together, even though they've been apart." After Sandra hung up, Joshua sat in his empty apartment and tried to process the reality that by Sunday evening, this space would be home to 4 people instead of 2. In 3 days, he would officially become the father of twins he'd met by a fence 6 months ago. Children who'd walked into his life hungry and hopeful and somehow convinced him to rebuild his entire world around their needs. He called Marcus's school and arranged to pick him up early, wanting to share the news in person rather than waiting until evening. When Marcus emerged from the building and saw his father's truck in the pickup lane at 2:30 p.m., his first expression was worry. "Is everything okay, Dad?" "Everything's perfect, buddy. Get in." Joshua waited until they were home, sitting at the kitchen table where they'd shared so many conversations about Emma and Luke before he delivered the news. "They said yes," he said simply. "Emma and Luke are coming home this Saturday." Marcus's reaction was pure 8-year-old joy. A whoop of excitement followed immediately by a flood of practical questions. Where would they put their clothes? Did they like the same cereals he did? Would they want to see his rock collection? Could they all build a fort in the backyard? "Slow down," Joshua laughed, pulling his son into a hug. "We'll figure it all out together." That evening, they called Dorothy to share the news with Luke. When the phone was passed to him, Luke's voice was quiet but vibrant with happiness. "Mr. Joshua, Mrs. Dorothy says I get to come live with you and Marcus for real this time. That's right, buddy. You and Emma both, forever." Joshua felt his throat tighten at the hope in that single word. "If you want it to be forever, then yes, I do want that," Luke said with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. "I already packed my clothes and my art supplies, and I made Emma a welcome home present that I've been saving since Christmas." The next 2 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Joshua took Friday off work to clean, shop for groceries, and set up the bedrooms that had been waiting empty for months. Marcus helped with the kind of focused energy he usually reserved for snow days and birthdays, arranging and rearranging furniture until everything felt perfect. They bought new bedding in colors. Dorothy had mentioned the twins liked soft. Green for Emma, blue for Luke. Joshua stocked the kitchen with foods he'd learned they enjoyed. The peanut butter and grape jelly Luke preferred. The apples Emma always chose when given options. The crackers they'd both nibbled carefully during those long-go lunches by the fence. Most importantly, Joshua set aside time to talk with Marcus about the changes coming to their family. They discussed house rules, sharing responsibilities, and the reality that Emma and Luke might need time to feel safe and settled in their new home. "They might test us," Joshua explained, remembering his foster care training. "Not because they're bad kids, but because they need to know we're not going anywhere when things get difficult." Marcus nodded seriously. "Like when I was scared after Mom left and I broke your favorite mug on purpose to see if you'd send me away too?" Joshua looked at his son with fresh appreciation for the wisdom 8-year-olds sometimes carried. Exactly like that. Saturday morning arrived clear and cold with the kind of bright Nebraska sunlight that made everything look possible. Joshua and Marcus were dressed and ready by 9 a.m., though the twins weren't expected until noon. They spent the morning doing busy work, making beds that were already made, checking supplies they'd already checked, and watching the clock with the nervous energy of people waiting for their lives to begin. At 11:45 a.m., 2 cars pulled into the apartment complex parking lot simultaneously, Dorothy's familiar sedan and Sandra's state vehicle, arriving like a carefully choreographed reunion. Joshua and Marcus met them outside, and Joshua's first sight of Emma and Luke together again, after 4 months of separation, was something he knew he'd remember for the rest of his life. They ran toward each other with the desperate urgency of siblings who'd been artificially separated, colliding in a hug that was fierce and relieved and completely unself-conscious. Emma, who'd grown taller during their time apart, wrapped her arms around Luke like she was afraid he might disappear again.
Nice.
Luke buried his face in his sister's shoulder and whispered something that made her laugh, the first genuine laughter Joshua had heard from either of them since before Betty's hospitalization. "They've been asking about each other constantly for the past week," Sandra said quietly to Joshua as they watched the reunion. "I think they were afraid this might not really happen." Emma looked up from her embrace with Luke and saw Joshua standing nearby. Her expression shifted through several emotions: relief, uncertainty, hope, something that looked remarkably like the carefully controlled gratitude he remembered from their first meeting. "Mr. Joshua," she said, approaching him with Luke's hand firmly in hers, "thank you for not forgetting about us." Joshua knelt down to their eye level, looking at these 2 children who'd somehow become his children without him quite realizing. "When the transition had occurred, I could never forget about you," he said simply. "Your family." The first few hours were a careful dance of reacquaintance and exploration. Emma and Luke toured their new bedrooms with the cautious wonder of children who'd learned not to get too attached to spaces that might be temporary. They examined Marcus's rock collection with appropriate seriousness, listened to his explanation of the fort-building possibilities in the backyard, and shared the lunch Joshua had prepared with the formal politeness of guests who weren't quite sure they were welcome to stay. But gradually, the formality began to dissolve. Luke found Joshua's art supplies and settled at the kitchen table to draw, his tongue poking out in concentration just like it always had. Emma discovered that Marcus's comic book collection included several titles she'd always wanted to read, and the 2 of them sprawled on the living room floor, sharing stories and observations. That evening, they made dinner together, all 4 of them crowded into the small kitchen. bumping elbows and negotiating space with the awkward choreography of people learning to share a home. Joshua assigned simple tasks. Emma could wash vegetables, Luke could set the table, Marcus could help with cooking. Nothing complicated, just the basic rituals of family life that these children had been missing for months, as they sat around the table eating spaghetti and salad. Joshua realized that this was what he'd been unconsciously working toward since that first day at the fence. Not just providing food or shelter, but creating a space where children could be children. Where love was demonstrated through daily care rather than grand gestures. Where family was built one shared meal at a time. "Mr. Joshua," Emma said carefully. As they finished eating, "What do we call you now?" It was a question Joshua had been expecting but hadn't quite figured out how to answer. The foster care training had covered this. Children in placement sometimes struggled with what to call their caregivers, especially when their relationships to birth family were complicated. "What would you like to call me?" he asked. Emma and Luke exchanged one of their silent conversations. The kind of communication that twins perfected and outsiders could only admire. "Could we call you Dad?" Luke asked quietly. "I mean, if that's okay with you and Marcus?" Marcus looked up from his plate with a grin. "That's what I call him, too." "Then that's settled," Joshua said, though his voice was rougher than usual. "Dad it is." The first few weeks were a process of adjustment and discovery for all of them.
Ow.
Emma struggled with nightmares and needed a nightlight and the reassurance that someone would always come if she called out. Luke hoarded food in his dresser drawer until Joshua gently explained that there would always be enough, that he never needed to worry about going hungry again. Marcus navigated the transition from only child to big brother with remarkable grace, sharing his space and his father's attention with generous enthusiasm. He helped Luke learn the route to school, introduced Emma to his favorite teachers, somehow managed to make two children who'd felt displaced and uncertain begin to feel like they belonged. Joshua learned to navigate the complex emotions of children who've experienced trauma, working with therapists and social workers to understand behaviors that seemed puzzling until viewed through the lens of abandonment and loss. He learned that healing wasn't linear, that good days were followed by difficult ones, and that patience was the most important gift he could offer. But he also learned that resilience was real, that children who'd survived impossible circumstances could flourish when given safety and consistency. He watched Emma slowly begin to trust that adults would follow through on their promises. He saw Luke's artwork evolve from pictures of missing family members to drawings of their new life together. He witnessed Marcus grow in empathy and maturity as he helped his new siblings feel welcome and secure. 3 months after Emma and Luke moved in, Joshua received an unexpected phone call from Dorothy. "I wanted to let you know," she said, "Betty. Clearwater asked if she could write letters to the children. She's doing much better physically, and she understands that she can't care for them. But she'd like to maintain some contact if that's appropriate." Joshua discussed it with Emma and Luke that evening, giving them the choice about whether they wanted to hear from their grandmother. "Yes," Emma said immediately. "I want to know that she's okay. Can we write back to her?" Luke asked. "Of course." The correspondence that developed between Betty and the twins became another kind of healing. She sent letters full of memories about their early childhood, family stories they'd been too young to remember, and proud updates about their progress that Dorothy shared with her. Emma and Luke wrote back about school, their new friends, their artwork, and the ordinary details of daily life that grandmothers treasured. It was Emma who suggested they invite Betty to visit for Luke's 10th birthday in September. Joshua worried about the logistics and emotions involved. But when he called to extend the invitation, Betty's response was immediate gratitude. "I've been hoping you'd ask," she said. "I know I can't be their guardian anymore, but I'll always be their grandmother. I'd like to meet the man who gave them the family I couldn't provide." Betty's visit was everything Joshua had hoped it would be, and nothing like what he'd feared. She arrived in Dorothy's car, moving slowly but with determination, carrying wrapped gifts and stories about Emma and Luke's early years. She spent the weekend sleeping on their couch, sharing meals at their kitchen table, and watching her grandchildren thrive in ways she'd always wanted but couldn't achieve. On her last evening with them, Betty pulled Joshua aside for a private conversation. "I need to thank you," she said, settling into a chair on their small balcony while the children played in the backyard below. "Not just for taking care of them, but for giving them something I never could." "What's that? A future without fear," Betty said simply. "Emma and Luke lived with me because I loved them. But they also lived with the constant worry that I might get sick, that they might have to take care of me, that everything could fall apart at any moment. With you, they get to just be children." Joshua looked down at the backyard where Emma was pushing Marcus on a swing while Luke drew pictures of the flowers they'd planted together. "They gave me something too," he said. "They taught me that family isn't just about who you're related to. It's about who shows up, who stays, who chooses to love you even when it's not easy." 6 months later, on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 1 year after Sandra's phone call, Joshua stood in a courthouse in Lincoln with Emma, Luke, and Marcus, surrounded by Dorothy, Betty, Sandra, and a handful of friends who'd become their chosen family over the past year. Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, looked down at the four of them from her bench. "Mr. Martinez," she said formally, "do you promise to provide a safe, loving, and stable home for Emma and Luke Clearwater, to support their physical, emotional, and educational needs, and to maintain their connections to their extended family and community?" "I do," Joshua said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Emma and Luke," Judge Morrison addressed the twins directly, "do you want Joshua Martinez to be your father legally and permanently?" "Yes," they said in unison, Luke adding, quietly, "He already is our dad." "Then by the power vested in me by the state of Nebraska, I hereby grant this petition for adoption. Emma and Luke, you are now officially Emma and Luke Martinez, with all the rights and responsibilities of that relationship." The gavel came down with a sound that felt like punctuation on a story that had taken over a year to write. Emma burst into tears, happy tears, she assured everyone quickly. Luke immediately began planning a drawing to commemorate the day. Marcus asked if this meant they were extra family now, which made the adults laugh and cry simultaneously. Afterward, they celebrated at a restaurant that served breakfast all day, because Emma had mentioned once that she thought adoption should be celebrated with pancakes. Dorothy presented them with a photo album documenting their journey from that first meeting at the fence to this day in court. Betty gave each child a small piece of jewelry that had belonged to their great-grandmother, connecting them to family history while celebrating their new future. That evening, as they sat around their kitchen table, sharing takeout, Chinese food, and talking about the day, Joshua looked at his 3 children and marveled at the impossible mathematics of love. A year and a half ago, he'd been a single father struggling to provide for 1 child. Now, he was the father of 3, and somehow their small apartment felt more abundant than any mansion could have. "Dad," Emma said, interrupting his thoughts, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "Do you remember what you told Luke and me that first day about how families take care of each other?" Joshua nodded, though the memory felt like it belonged to different people, living different lives. "I think you were wrong about something," Emma continued. "Said families take care of each other, like it goes both ways. But I think you took care of us way more than we took care of you." "Emma," Joshua said gently, "you and Luke taught me what it means to be brave. You showed me that love multiplies instead of dividing, that opening your heart to more people makes it bigger, not emptier. You gave me a reason to be better than I thought I could be." Luke looked up from the fortune cookie he'd been carefully unwrapping. "My fortune says the best things in life come to those who share. Do you think that's true?" Joshua looked around the table at these 3 children who'd taught him everything he needed to know about generosity, resilience, and the quiet miracles that happened when people chose to care for each other. "I think," he said, "that's the truest thing anyone ever wrote." Outside their windows, the Nebraska spring was beginning in earnest. Soon they would plant a garden in the small patch of earth behind their building. Emma wanted vegetables, Luke wanted flowers, and Marcus wanted to try growing pumpkins for Halloween. They would do all 3, because that's what families did. They found ways to honor everyone's dreams in the same small space. And somewhere in Millbrook, at the chain-link fence outside the meatpacking plant, new children might be walking. along the county road, looking for kindness from strangers who had enough to share. Joshua made a mental note to talk to his supervisor about organizing a company food drive, about creating systems that caught children before they fell through the cracks, because he'd learned something important over the past year and a half. Kindness wasn't just about individual gestures. It was about building communities where everyone looked out for each other, where no child had to walk 5 miles for a sandwich, where love was both personal and systemic, both individual and institutional. As they cleaned up dinner and prepared for another ordinary evening in their extraordinary life, Joshua realized that this was what miracles actually looked like. Not dramatic interventions or impossible circumstances, but small choices made consistently over time. Love shared until it multiplied beyond recognition, and the quiet persistence of people who refused to give up on each other. 12 miracles, he thought, remembering Emma's words from that long-ago day at the fence. But he'd lost count somewhere along the way, because once you started paying attention, it turned out miracles were everywhere. As common as shared meals, and as simple as showing up when someone needed you to stay. 5 years later, I'm on a crisp autumn morning in October. Joshua Martinez stood in the parking lot of Riverside Elementary School watching his children pile out of their minivan with the chaotic energy of siblings who'd spent the 20-minute drive debating everything from lunch trades to playground strategies. Emma, now 14 and taller than Joshua had ever imagined she'd grow, shouldered her backpack with the efficient movements of a teenager who'd learned to navigate the world with confidence. Luke, artistic as ever, clutched a portfolio of drawings he planned to submit for the school's art competition. And Marcus, now 13 and officially the middle child, in ways that both delighted and occasionally frustrated him, was already scanning the schoolyard for his friends. Dad, Emma said, pausing at the school entrance. Don't forget about the parent-teacher conferences tonight. Mrs. Patterson specifically asked to meet with you about Luke's advanced art placement. And don't forget my soccer game tomorrow, Marcus added. Coach says college scouts sometimes come to middle school games now. Luke looked up from his portfolio. That's not true, Marcus. College scouts don't look at 7th graders. You don't know everything about sports just because you're good at art, Marcus shot back, but without real heat. Their sibling banter had evolved into something comfortable and familiar over the years. Guys, Joshua interrupted with the practiced authority of a father who'd learned to referee 3 strong-willed children. School first, debates later. Have a good day. He watched them disappear into the building, marveling at how normal this scene had become. 5 years ago, he couldn't have imagined himself as the father of 3 teenagers. Couldn't have pictured himself driving a minivan or attending art exhibitions and soccer games and parent-teacher conferences with the casual competence of someone who'd been doing it his whole life. But here he was. And more surprisingly, here they all were, thriving in ways that still sometimes took his breath away. The drive to work took him past Sunset Vista, where the trailer park had been converted into affordable housing units with a community garden and a small playground. The transformation had happened gradually, funded by a combination of state grants and private donations that Dorothy had helped organize through her expanding network of foster care advocates. Joshua smiled as he passed the garden where he could see Mrs. Henderson, one of the new residents, working among the fall vegetables with her twin grandsons. Different children, different circumstances, but the same fundamental truth. Families came in all configurations, and love grew wherever. People decided to plant it at the meatpacking plant. Joshua's role had evolved significantly over the past 5 years. He still worked the processing line, but he'd also become the unofficial coordinator of the company's employee assistance program, helping workers navigate everything from childcare issues to housing problems to the maze of social services that he'd learned to navigate so well during his own journey toward becoming a foster parent. It had started small, with Joshua simply sharing information about resources he'd discovered during his own struggles. But word had spread, and now he spent part of each day connecting coworkers with food banks, helping them understand medical assistance programs, or just listening when someone needed to talk through a crisis with someone who understood what It meant to feel overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. Joshua called Maria Santos, one of the line supervisors, as he clocked in for his shift. "There's a new guy starting today, single father with a couple of kids. Thought maybe you could talk to him during lunch break, help him understand what programs are available." Joshua nodded. Over the years, he'd lost count of how many conversations he'd had like this, how many families he'd helped connect with resources, or simply reassured that struggling didn't mean failing. It had become as natural as breathing, this extension of the kindness that had started with two hungry children at a fence. During his lunch break, instead of eating alone, Joshua sought out the new employee, a man named David Rodriguez, who looked exhausted in the particular way of single parents trying to hold everything together simultaneously. "Mind if I sit?" Joshua asked, approaching David's table in the break room. David looked up, clearly surprised to have someone voluntarily seeking his company on his first day. "Sure, I guess." Joshua introduced himself, and over the course of their 30-minute break, learned that David was raising two daughters, ages 6 and 8, after his wife had left 6 months earlier. He was struggling with childcare, worried about the girls walking home from school alone, trying to figure out how to stretch his paycheck to cover expenses. He'd never had to manage by himself. It was a story Joshua had heard variations of dozens of times over the years, and each time it took him back to those early days of his own single parenthood. The fear and uncertainty that had felt so overwhelming until he'd learned where to find help. "There's an after-school program at Lincoln Elementary," Joshua said, pulling out his phone to share contact information. "It's income-based, so you'd probably qualify for reduced fees. And there's a food pantry at St. Mary's that distributes groceries every Thursday evening, no questions asked, no paperwork required." David wrote down the information with the careful attention of someone who understood that details mattered when resources were scarce. "How do you know all this?" David asked. Joshua smiled, thinking about how to explain a journey that had started with shared sandwiches and evolved into a completely different understanding of community and care. "I learned it the hard way," he said simply. "If I learned it, I might as well share it." That evening, after attending Luke's art exhibition, where his portfolio had earned first place in the middle school division, Joshua found himself in the familiar position of driving 3 tired but chattering children home through the Nebraska darkness. "Dad," Emma said from the passenger seat, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "You know how you always help people at work figure out how to get help with their problems?" "Yeah. Well, I was thinking maybe I could do something like that at school. Like maybe start a peer counseling program or something," Mrs. Chen says. "Lots of kids don't know about the free lunch program or the clothes closet or the homework help sessions." Joshua glanced at his daughter, struck by how naturally she'd inherited his instinct for connecting people with resources they needed. Emma had grown into a teenager who noticed when classmates were struggling and had the confidence to do something about it. "That sounds like a great idea," he said. "Want help figuring out how to get it started?" "Maybe I want to try doing some research first, see what other schools are doing." From the back seat, Luke looked up from the sketchbook where he'd been drawing by the light of passing street lamps. "I could make posters for it, maybe design some kind of resource guide that looks friendlier than the official school handouts." Who'd been quiet for most of the drive suddenly spoke up. "You know what we should do? We should have everyone over for dinner this weekend. Like everyone. Dorothy and Betty and Sandra and Mrs. Chen and maybe some of the people Dad helps at work." Joshua felt his chest warm at his son's suggestion. Over the years, their family dinners had grown to include an ever-expanding network of people who'd become important to them: foster care workers, teachers, neighbors, co-workers, and the various adults who'd helped them navigate the complexities of building a family across traditional boundaries. "That's a lot of people for our dining room," Joshua said. "We could use the community center," Emma suggested. "Make it like a potluck. Everyone brings something to share." "I like that idea," Luke said. "We could make it a celebration of all the families that help each other." As they pulled into their driveway, Joshua realized that his children had unconsciously articulated something he'd been feeling but hadn't quite been able to put into words. Their family had become the center of a web of relationships that extended far beyond their household. A network of people who looked out for each other in ways both large and small. It wasn't the kind of family structure that appeared in television, shows, or greeting card advertisements. But it was real and resilient and absolutely essential to how they'd all learn to thrive. Later that night, after homework was finished and everyone was settled for bed, Joshua sat at his kitchen table, paying bills and planning the week ahead. It was a scene that would have looked familiar to anyone who'd known him 5 years earlier, but everything about it felt different now. The bills were more manageable, partly because his salary had increased with his expanded responsibilities at work, but mostly because he'd learned to navigate systems and resources that made survival less of a month-to-month crisis. The planning involved coordinating 3 children's schedules instead of 1, which was more complicated but also more full of possibility. Most importantly, he was no longer planning alone. Emma had become his partner in managing household logistics. Luke contributed his artistic talents to everything from school projects to birthday decorations. And Marcus had developed into the family's social coordinator, always thinking of ways to bring people together. They'd become a team in ways Joshua had never expected, each person contributing their strengths to support the whole. As he prepared for bed, Joshua checked on each of his children, a ritual he'd maintained since they were small, and one he suspected he'd continue long after they were grown. Emma was reading by lamplight, already working her way through college-level books about social work and community organizing. Luke had fallen asleep with his sketchbook open beside him, a half-finished drawing of their family dinner table visible. On the page, Marcus was fast asleep, his soccer cleats neatly arranged by his bedroom door, in preparation for morning practice. Standing in his hallway, looking at these 3 young people who'd taught him everything important he knew about love and resilience and the power of showing up consistently for people who mattered, Joshua felt the quiet satisfaction that came from building something meaningful one day at a time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help, new ways to demonstrate that families were created through choice and commitment, rather than just biology. There would be homework to help with, games to attend, problems to solve, and meals to share around a table that somehow always had room for one more person. But tonight, all 3 of his children were safe and happy and preparing for futures. That looked bright with possibility. Tonight, he could rest in the knowledge that kindness, shared consistently over time, really did multiply in ways that defied every rule about scarcity and limitation. Outside his windows, the Nebraska autumn was settling into winter, and somewhere in town, other families were navigating their own challenges and discoveries. Some of them would find their way to resources and support systems that people like Joshua and Dorothy and Sandra had worked to build and maintain. Others would find their own paths, their own ways of turning individual struggles into community strength, and occasionally, someone would remember that it all started with a simple choice to share what little they had with children who needed more than food. They needed to know that adults could be trusted to stay, to care, to keep showing up even when things got difficult. That was the real miracle, Joshua thought as he turned off the lights and headed to bed. Not the dramatic interventions or impossible circumstances, but the ordinary decision to treat love as something that grew stronger when it was shared, something that multiplied instead of diminishing when extended to include more people. 12. Miracles, Emma had called them all those years ago. But Joshua had learned that miracles weren't events that happened and then ended. They were ways of living that continued, day after day. In kitchen conversations and school pickup lines and workplace break rooms and community dinners where everyone was welcome and everyone had something to contribute, the circle of kindness had no end. And that, perhaps, was the most miraculous thing of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.